Today is a very fun day. We are going to learn action potential. Yay! Let me show you something cool. See, this is a typical drawing of a neuron. You have the dendrites where the signal comes in. You have the axon where the signal travels through, and you have the axon terminal where the signal leaves. See, the axon is where the action potentials happen. It is covered by a fatty layer called the myelin sheath, and it serves to protect and electrically insulate the axon. Now this part right here, the part where the cell body and the axon connect, there's this area right here called the axon hillock. That is where an action potential starts. The charge of the axon is resting membrane potential of a negative 70 millivolts. So an action potential, before it begins, the resting membrane potential is negative 70 millivolts. Then a stimulus occurs and sodium channels begin to open. The activation gates open and a few sodium ions go through, causing the inside of the cell to begin to get positive, and then it goes to negative 60 millivolts. Once it reaches negative 60, threshold occurs. This is the magnitude it must reach for the action potential to happen. Once it reaches negative 60, the depolarization phase occurs, and this is where all the sodium ions open for the sodium ions to go through to the other side of the cell. Once it reaches close to plus 30 millivolts, the inactivation gates begin to close on those channels, and then the activation gates of the potassium channels open, causing the potassium ions to leave the cell. This is called depolarization. Depolarization occurs to bring back the cell's charge to normal. Once it starts getting close to negative 70, the inactivation gates of the potassium channels begin to close. But the potassium channels close slower than the sodium channels, so it reaches a negative 90. The charge of a negative 90 millivolts is called hyperpolarization. Negative 90 is not the resting potential, so sodium-potassium pumps begin to work, so the charge goes back to regular, which is a negative 70. The cell is happy. This here is a diagram that shows what happens during an action potential. We begin here at negative 70, which is the resting membrane potential, negative 70 millivolts. A stimulus occurs, which brings an excitable cell to threshold. Threshold is just the magnitude it has to reach for the action potential to occur. Right here, where it begins to go positive from negative 70 to negative 60, it means that a few voltage-gated sodium channels have opened, and sodium ions begin to influx, which means goes inside the cell. Stimulus reaches threshold, depolarization happens. Depolarization is just the rising phase where all the sodium channels are open. So when the charge reaches almost 30, plus 30, the inactivation gates of the sodium ions begin to close and the activation gates of the potassium gates begin to open. When the gates of potassium open, repolarization happens. This is causing the charge of the cell to go back down to negative 70. Polarization, the charge of the cell begins to go down to its resting potential, which is negative 70. As potassium ions efflux, which means as they're leaving the cell, the charge begins to go down. Potassium ion channels take longer to close, which causes this part right here. This phase right here is called hyperpolarization. This means that it surpasses the resting potential, making the charge a negative 90. When hyperpolarization happens, sodium and potassium pumps begin working to bring the charge back to resting potential. So this period right here is known as an absolute refractory period. This means that no stimulus can occur because it's already undergoing an action potential. This part right here is called a relative refractory period, which means a stimulus may occur or may be accepted by the neuron.